Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menasce. On yesterday's show, we made a case for how our gross domestic product statistics are being manipulated. It turns out that not all statistics are manipulated. These statistics don't get the same scrutiny from the voting public as the inflation numbers, but they reveal the underlying truth in what's happening. On today's show, we're going to make a case for the argument that many Western countries are already in recession. That includes the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, and parts of Western Europe. We just don't know it. If you look at the import and export figures for the US, you will find that these numbers are not manipulated. They are the straight-up numbers. In the month of March that just passed, we saw import prices increase by 2.6%, and export prices increased by 4.5% for the month. Well, the US, Canadian, and European governments have all previously stated that they have a 2% inflation target for the year. A 4.5% price increase in a single month is a huge price increase. That's on top of the 3% increase in February and the consensus estimate of 2.2% for the month. If that rate were to sustain for 12 months of the year, we would be talking about price increases of nearly 50% in a single year. You might conclude that while 4.5% in a month sounds like a large number, it doesn't matter that much if foreign customers have to pay more for products that are exported. But here's the important question to ask yourself. Do you think it's very likely that domestic producers have increased prices for export, but have not made those same price increases for domestic consumption? The obvious answer is clearly those domestic prices have gone up by a similar amount, but they're not being reflected in the inflation metrics. Why are they not being reflected in the inflation numbers? They're not being reflected in the inflation metrics because those numbers are overly manipulated and they're not an accurate reflection of what's happening in the economy. Import prices jumped 2.6% in March after 1.6% in February and 2% in January. On an annualized basis, we could expect those numbers, if they went into an inflation metric, to be in excess of 20% when we extrapolate these price increases just for imports alone. Now, right now, the official government statistics is that inflation accelerated at 8.6% in March. There's no way that inflation is 8.6% when import prices are rising at a rate of more than 20% a year and export prices are rising at a rate of nearly 50% a year. The numbers just don't add up. The Bureau of Economic Analysis has not published numbers for the first quarter of 2022, but the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta published a paper last week that put together a consensus estimate of the forecast from a number of sources. The range of forecasts was for GDP growth of 1.8% annualized at the high end to 0.5% annualized at the low end for the first quarter. The consensus estimate is approximately 1% annualized real GDP growth. But as we talked about yesterday, the calculation of real GDP requires you take the nominal GDP that's inclusive of inflation and subtract out the inflation component to get the real GDP. But if inflation is being vastly understated, and I'm making the case that it is, then the number for real GDP is being overstated. If inflation is running above the government's stated numbers, then GDP is much less than what the government is telling you. We see the statistics in other parts of the economy. Price increases mean that consumers are buying less. They can be spending as much money, but they're buying less stuff. If retail sales numbers are increasing but sales volumes are falling, then we know the economy is actually shrinking in real terms. So let's test that theory and see if it holds up in practice. In the US, e-commerce sales were $222 billion in the second quarter of 2021. They were $214 billion in the third quarter and $218 billion during the hot holiday period in the fourth quarter. But remember, these figures fail to take price increases into account. They ignore inflation because the metric is dollars. The number of packages shipped actually fell during that time period. The number of packages shipped also fell in Q1. So in real terms, the volume of items being purchased is actually falling. That is the real test of real GDP. If less stuff is being sold at higher prices, then real GDP is falling. Now I realize the purists in the crowd will take issue with my math. They will argue that my math is not rigorous. But I will argue that I don't have to have 3 decimal points of accuracy to draw a simple conclusion. Our economy is shrinking, and we are in recession right now. We just don't know it. It hasn't been stated publicly by official sources. It'll only be stated publicly when the data is inescapable. Of course, when the government announces that economic contraction is upon us, there will be a chorus of blame. Governments will blame the Russians. They'll blame the 6th wave of COVID-19. But the outcome of the first quarter was largely cast before the invasion of the Ukraine had even started. If the first quarter of growth was at 1% growth annualized, which means contraction because inflation was vastly understated, there's no way the Russians could be to blame for the economic contraction that was already underway. The war in the Ukraine certainly won't help, and we can expect to see further economic weakness in the second quarter. The Fed has been saying it's trying to find a balance between stimulative action to protect a fragile economy and combating inflation with monetary policy. And once the reality of this economic contraction hits home, I expect to see a reversal of Fed policy in the second half of the year. As you think about that, pay very close attention to metrics that might be telling you we are already in economic contraction. Have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.